She couldn't speak or remember her name, but he knew she was his wife. What if the world took everything from you, then returned it in a form you could no longer recognize? What if the blizzard that howled like a hungry wolf, the same kind of storm that had stolen your heart and your future, brought a gift to your door? For Silas Blackwood, a man carved from the rock and sorrow of the Montana territories, that question was no idle thought. It was the ghost knocking on his cabin door, carried on a wind that had teeth. The storm had raged for 3 days. A white curtain dropped over the world, erasing mountains and memory alike. It had been a year to the day since a similar squall had claimed the stagecoach carrying his Sarah and their little boy, leaving him a man hollowed out, a walking echo in a silent home. Now, as the wind finally began to weary, he heard it. Not a knock, but a desperate, rhythmic thudding against the wood, a sound almost lost in the gale. He grabbed his rifle, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. Bandits or beasts, it mattered little. He was no longer a man with anything left to lose. He pulled the heavy door inward, and the wind screamed, throwing a flurry of snow and ice into the room, momentarily blinding him. There, collapsed on his threshold, was a figure, a woman, her clothes torn and frozen, her hair a mess of ice and dark strands plastered to a face as white as the snow she lay in. Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, staring into a distance only she could see, a terror etched so deep it had frozen there. She wasn't moving, save for the shallow, ragged breaths that ghosted in the frigid air. Silas knelt, his rough, calloused hands hesitating before they touched her. He expected to find her half dead, but there was a flicker, a stubborn warmth beneath the layers of ice. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, a bundle of chilled bones and drenched wool. As he carried her inside and kicked the door shut against the howling wind, the firelight caught her face, and Silas's world stopped. The shape of her jaw, the curve of her brow, the dark sweep of her lashes against a pale cheek. It couldn't be. Sarah? The name was a breath, a prayer he hadn't dared utter in a year. The woman didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered, then closed. No recognition, no sound. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth, his mind reeling, a storm inside him that matched the one still dying outside. The world was a cruel and random thing. It took without reason. It did not give back. Yet here she was, a woman who wore his wife's face, delivered by the same cruel hand of nature that had snatched her away. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, a conviction born of pure, desperate hope, that this was his Sarah. She was hurt, she was lost, she couldn't speak or remember. But he knew he would make her remember. He would bring her back from the cold, just as he had brought her in from the storm. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, a purpose he hadn't felt in a year of listless sunrises and lonely dusks. His hands, accustomed to the heft of an axe and the reins of a horse, became instruments of surprising gentleness. He cut away the frozen, tattered remnants of her dress, his gaze clinical, detached, avoiding anything that felt like a violation. He saw the bruises that marred her skin, ugly purple and blue marks on her arms and back, telling a story of violence that preceded the storm. A hot, protective anger coiled in his gut. Who had done this to her? He wrapped her in his warmest wool blankets and began to chafe her hands and feet, trying to coax life back into the frozen extremities. Her skin was like marble, cold and unyielding. He brewed a broth, rich and steaming, and when she stirred, her eyelids fluttering weakly, he propped her head up and spooned the warm liquid past her lips. She swallowed instinctively, a purely reflexive action, but it was enough. It was a sign. Life, stubborn and resilient, was holding on. Throughout the night, he sat by the fire, watching her. The silence of the cabin, once a crushing weight, was now filled with a tense anticipation. He studied her face in the flickering light, memorizing details he thought were lost to him forever. The small mole just above her lip, the way a single strand of dark hair fell across her forehead. It was Sarah. It had to be. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. The land had beaten that out of him long ago. But grief was its own landscape, with mirages that looked so real you could die of thirst trying to reach them. Was this a mirage, or was it a miracle? He refused to believe it was the former. To believe that would be to let the last ember of hope in his soul die out completely. He saw a thin silver chain around her neck, tucked beneath the collar of her ruined chemise. He gently pulled it free. A small silver locket, dented and tarnished. His breath hitched. He had given Sarah a locket just like it. With trembling fingers, he tried to open it, but the clasp was bent, sealed shut by the impact that had clearly thrown her from whatever conveyance she had been on. He set it on the mantelpiece, a piece of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. If it wasn't his Sarah, if that locket held the face of another man, another life, his fragile, reconstructed world would shatter. For now, it was better not to know. It was better to believe. When dawn broke, painting the snow-covered world in hues of soft pink and grey, the woman's eyes opened. This time, they were clear, but they were filled with a profound and terrifying emptiness. She stared at him, at the log walls of the cabin, at the fire, and there was nothing, no recognition, just the raw, primal fear of an animal in a strange and threatening place. She tried to speak, her mouth opening, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. A tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She couldn't speak. She couldn't remember. And as Silas looked at her, his heart ached with a mixture of pity and a fierce, possessive joy. "It's all right, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're home. You're safe now." The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a winter sun over a silent white world. He called her Sarah, and she did not object. She could not. Her voice was a prisoner in her own throat, locked away with her memories. At first she was a skittish thing, flinching whenever he moved too quickly, her eyes wide with a fear that had no name. She would watch him from the corner chair, wrapped in one of his oversized shirts and a heavy blanket, a silent observer in a life that felt like a dream. Silas moved with a deliberate slowness around her, a quiet patience that was entirely at odds with the hardened exterior he presented to the world. He spoke to her in a low, steady murmur, not expecting a response, but simply to fill the silence, to weave a tapestry of sound around them that felt like safety. He told her stories. He told her about the day they met, about the wildflowers she used to gather in the spring, about the way she laughed. He was not just telling her stories. He was trying to rebuild her, memory by memory, from a blueprint only he possessed. He was willing her to be the woman he had lost. And a strange thing began to happen. In the absence of her own memories, she began to absorb his. She would listen, her head tilted, as he described her fondness for the scent of baking bread. The next day, he found her in the small kitchen area, her hands hesitantly kneading a lump of dough, a look of intense concentration on her face. The bread she made was dense and uneven, but as they ate it together by the firelight, a flicker of something new passed between them. It was not memory, but it was a connection. Her hands, once soft and bruised, began to show the signs of work. She mended his clothes with small, neat stitches, her fingers moving with an innate grace. She learned the rhythm of his life, the early mornings tending to the horse and 2 milk cows in the lean-to barn, the long afternoons chopping wood, the quiet evenings by the fire. She became a part of that rhythm, She couldn't offer him words, but she offered him presence. She would have a hot meal ready for him when he came in from the cold, his eyebrows thick with frost. She would tend the fire, her silhouette a dark, comforting shape against the flames. They communicated through a language of gestures and shared glances. A nod from him was praise. A small, hesitant smile from her was a victory. The fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She would watch his hands as he carved a piece of wood, her gaze tracing the strong, capable lines. He was carving a small bird, its wings outstretched. When he finished, he placed it on the mantel, next to the sealed locket. He did not say that he had carved a dozen such birds for his Sarah, one for every year they'd known each other. He did not have to. The woman reached out a trembling finger and touched the smooth wood, a question in her eyes. He simply nodded. "You always loved birds," he said, his voice thick, and in that moment she almost believed him. The cabin, once a tomb of memory for Silas, slowly transformed into a sanctuary. The sharp edges of his grief began to soften, blurred by the daily routine of caring for this woman who wore his wife's face. He found himself smiling, a strange and rusty action, when she managed to coax a thin stream of milk from the stubborn old cow. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire when he saw her asleep in the chair, her face peaceful in the amber glow, the deep lines of fear momentarily erased. He slept on a cot on the other side of the room, giving her the bed. In the deep quiet of the night, he would lie awake and listen to the soft sound of her breathing, a sound he had thought he would never hear again. It was a lie, a beautiful, fragile lie they were living, and he was terrified of the moment it would break. But the lie was better than the truth of his emptiness. For her, the world was a canvas wiped clean. She had no past, only the present moment. Her identity was a reflection in Silas's eyes. When he called her Sarah, she felt a ghost of a person take shape around her. This Sarah was loved. This Sarah was capable and kind. This Sarah belonged here, in this quiet cabin, safe from the howling wind. Slowly, tentatively, she began to inhabit this borrowed identity. She found a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a chest. It was filled with pressed flowers and a delicate, sloping handwriting. Sarah's handwriting. She would trace the words with her fingers, trying to feel a connection, a spark of recognition. The words spoke of a deep love for a good man, of a simple joy in the harshness of the frontier, of hopes for a child. She felt a profound sadness for this woman and a strange sense of envy. She had a life, a history. All she had were bruises and a terrifying blankness. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, she found something small and wooden under the bed. It was another carved bird, this one unfinished, the wood still pale and new. Beside it lay a small, worn set of baby shoes. She picked them up, the soft leather cool against her palm. A wave of dizziness washed over her, so intense she had to grip the bedpost for support. A flash of an image, hot and chaotic. Fire, shouting, the splintering of wood, the terrified scream of a child. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless and shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the tiny shoes in her hand, and for the first time, a feeling rose up in her that was undeniably her own. A deep, gut-wrenching sorrow that had nothing to do with the woman in the journal. It was a grief that belonged to her. When Silas came inside, he found her sitting on the bed, clutching the little shoes, silent tears streaming down her face. He stopped in the doorway, his own heart constricting. He knew those shoes. They were his son's. He walked over and gently took them from her hands, his touch lingering on her fingers. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply sat beside her, a silent, solid presence in the face of her nameless pain. In that shared, unspoken grief, Their fragile bond deepened, moving beyond the lie of a shared past and into the truth of a shared present. With the first thaws of spring, the world outside the cabin began to awaken, and with it, a new tension. The blanket of snow that had isolated and protected them was melting, revealing the muddy track that passed for a road a half-mile away. The world they had held at bay was coming back. Silas grew more watchful, his gaze often drifting to the road, a muscle tightening in his jaw. The lie they lived was a delicate thing, a bubble of quiet domesticity that could be popped by the arrival of a single stranger. He knew he should take her to the nearest town, to a doctor, to the law. He knew he should try to find out who she really was, but the thought of losing her again, of returning to the crushing silence, was a physical pain. He had become a dragon hoarding his treasure, a treasure he knew was not his to keep. He justified his inaction with practicality. She was still weak, still fragile. The town was a hard place, full of gossip and suspicion. She would not be safe there. It was better to wait. But he knew, in the deepest part of himself, that he was waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for her to look at him one day and say his name, for her to remember the life they had never shared. She, too, felt the change. The world was growing larger, and it frightened her. The cabin was her only point of reference, Silas her only anchor. The thought of leaving, of facing a world where she was nobody, was paralyzing. She clung to the identity of Sarah, not because she believed it, but because it was all she had. One day, a traveling peddler, the first human being she had seen besides Silas in months, guided his weary mule and cart down their track. Silas met him on the porch, his stance wide, protective, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip. The peddler, a wiry old man named Jeb, was harmless, full of news and gossip from the settlements. He looked past Silas and saw her standing in the doorway, a ghost in the shadows. "Good Lord, Silas," Jeb whispered, his eyes wide. "I'd heard talk you'd gone mad with grief up here, but I never thought... She looks just like her." Silas's jaw clenched. "It is her, Jeb. The storm. It brought her back." Jeb just shook his head slowly, a look of pity in his eyes. He sold Silas some flour and salt, his gaze continually straying to the silent woman. Before he left, he pressed a folded newspaper into Silas's hand. "From down territory," he said quietly. "There's talk of a stagecoach that went missing a few months back. Overturned in the Red Creek Pass. One survivor, a woman, wandered off into the blizzard before they could find her. They say she was traveling with her husband, a rich man from the east. Name of Corbin." Silas's blood ran cold. He took the paper, his hand stiff. After Jeb was gone, a speck on the horizon, Silas stood on the porch for a long time, the newspaper a lead weight in his hand. He looked back into the cabin at the woman who was humming a tuneless, hesitant melody as she stirred a pot over the fire. His Sarah. He could not bring himself to open the paper. He could not bear to read the name of the man who might come to claim her. Instead, he walked to the fire pit and dropped the paper into the flames, watching as the words turned to black ash and drifted away on the spring breeze. The unspoken truth lay between them, heavy and suffocating. Silas had destroyed the newspaper, but he could not destroy the words the peddler had spoken. A rich man from the east. Corbin. The name was a splinter under his skin. He became even more protective, his silences deeper, his mood darker. He began to patrol the edge of his property, rifle in hand, watching the road with a grim paranoia. He was no longer just a man protecting his home. He was a man guarding a secret, a lie he knew was crumbling. The woman he called Sarah felt his fear. It was a cold draft in their warm cabin. She saw the way his eyes scanned the horizon, the way he startled at the snap of a twig. His anxiety seeped into her, and her own nameless dread grew stronger. The flashes of memory were becoming more frequent, more violent. The scent of his pipe smoke would trigger a fleeting image of a different room, thick with cigar smoke and the cloying smell of expensive cologne. The sight of his gentle, calloused hands would conjure a phantom pain on her arm, the memory of a grip that was anything but gentle. She started to have nightmares, waking with a silent scream caught in her throat, her body drenched in sweat. She would see a face in her dreams, a handsome face with cold, cruel eyes. The name Corbin echoed in the darkness of her mind. She began to question everything. She would look at her reflection in a bucket of water, at the face of a stranger. Was this Sarah? Or was it someone else? Someone who had been running from something terrible. She would pick up the sealed locket from the mantel, turning it over and over in her hands. The truth was in there. She knew it. But like Silas, she was afraid to open it. To know who she was might mean losing the only safety she had ever known. One evening, as a storm gathered in the distant mountains, mirroring the one in their hearts, she found the courage. While Silas was in the barn, she took the locket and a small knife. Her hands trembled as she worked the blade into the damaged clasp. It took several minutes of painstaking effort, her breath held tight in her chest before the locket sprang open with a faint click. Inside, there were two miniature portraits. On one side was a man, impeccably dressed, with a condescending smirk and the same cold eyes from her nightmares. Corbin. On the other side was a woman with her face, but her eyes were different. They were vibrant, defiant, and full of a light that had long since been extinguished. And beneath the portrait, a tiny, elegant inscription, Annelise. Annelise. The name felt both alien and intimately familiar. It was her. She was Annelise. She was not Sarah. A wave of grief and relief washed over her. Grief for the woman she had been, and relief for the confirmation that she was not a ghost. She was real. At that moment, Silas walked in. He saw the open locket in her hand, the look on her face. The lie was over. He didn't have to ask. He saw the truth in her eyes, eyes that were no longer empty, but filled with the dawning, painful light of memory. Annelise, she whispered, the sound a raw, torn thing, the first word she had spoken in months. The name hung in the air between them, shattering the fragile world they had built. The sound of her own name, a ragged whisper from her own lips, was a key turning in a rusty lock. With it, the floodgates opened. Not everything came back at once, but in jagged, painful shards. The name Corbin brought with it the memory of a cold, gilded cage of a marriage, of a husband whose love was a suffocating ownership. He hadn't cherished her. He had collected her, a beautiful object to be displayed and controlled. She remembered his anger, a quiet, terrifying thing that simmered beneath a veneer of civility. She remembered the arguments, his voice a low hiss, his fingers digging into her arm. She remembered running, not from a stagecoach wreck, but from him. She had paid a driver to take her west, to disappear, but Corbin's reach was long. He had caught up to her at the Red Creek Pass. There had been a struggle, his men trying to drag her back. In the chaos, the carriage had overturned. She had scrambled free and fled into the blinding snow, the storm, her only ally. Her past was not a life of love and wildflowers with a gentle man. It was a life of fear and desperation. She looked at Silas, this gruff, solitary man who had shown her more kindness in a few months than her husband had in years. He had lied to her, yes, but it was a lie born of a deep and terrible loneliness. A lie that had, ironically, given her the sanctuary she needed to heal. He looked utterly broken, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. The ghost of his Sarah had vanished, leaving him alone once more with a stranger. The silence in the cabin was thick with everything they could not say. He had lost his wife a second time. She had found herself, only to be faced with the terrifying reality of what she had been running from. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "He'll come for you." It wasn't a question. The peddler! He said Corbin was looking for his wife. Annelise, the name felt stronger now, more real, nodded, her throat tight. She looked around the small, warm cabin. This place had become her world. This man, her protector. She would not run again. She would not let Corbin take this from her too. As if summoned by their fear, a sound cut through the evening quiet. The steady rhythmic beat of approaching horses. Not the slow plod of a peddler's mule, but the confident, purposeful gait of riders who knew their destination. Silas's head snapped up. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall, his movements swift and sure. The grief in his eyes was replaced by a hard, cold resolve. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was a man defending his home. "Get in the root cellar," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Don't make a sound." Annelise froze. The instinct to hide, to run, was overwhelming. It was what she had always done. But then she looked at Silas, standing tall and determined between her and the door, ready to face her monster for her. A new feeling surged through her, fierce and hot. It was courage. "No," she said, her voice stronger this time. She walked to the fireplace and grabbed the heavy iron poker, its weight solid and real in her hand. "Not again." Silas stared at her, surprised. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a fire he had never seen before. It was the fire of the woman in the locket. The defiant, vibrant Annelise. A grim, small smile touched his lips. He gave her a sharp nod. Together they stood in the center of the room, the firelight glinting on the rifle barrel and the iron poker, and waited as the hoofbeats stopped outside their door. The heavy thud of a boot on the porch was followed by a voice, smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel that made Annelise's blood run cold. "Annelise, my dear, I know you're in there. This foolishness has gone on long enough. Come outside." Silas moved to stand slightly in front of her, his rifle held loosely but ready. He did not answer. The door handle rattled, then a heavy shoulder slammed against the wood. The bar Silas had set in place held firm. "Don't make me destroy this quaint little hovel," Corbin called out, his voice losing its polished edge, replaced by an impatient anger. "I have 2 men with me. You are cornered. Your protector in there can either die bravely or live sensibly. The choice is his." Annelise's hand tightened on the poker. She could feel the tremor in her arm, but her resolve was like iron. She would not be the cause of this good man's death. She took a step forward, but Silas put out an arm to stop her, never taking his eyes off the door. "My fight," he said, his voice a low growl. "My home." The wood of the door groaned, then splintered near the lock under a second, more powerful blow. Corbin was not a patient man. Silas knew he couldn't win a prolonged gunfight against 3 men. His only advantage was the cabin itself, the single point of entry. He backed away from the door, moving toward the side of the entrance, motioning for Annelise to do the same on the opposite side. They would have only a moment when the door burst open. Just as he got into position, the door crashed inward, torn from its hinges. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. Corbin stood in the middle, dressed in a fine, dark travelling coat, his handsome face contorted with rage. His 2 hired men flanked him, pistols drawn. "There you are," Corbin said, his eyes locking on Annelise. His gaze dismissed Silas as nothing more than an obstacle. "Did you really think this peasant could protect you from me?" As he took a step inside, Silas acted. He didn't fire his rifle. Instead, he swung it like a club, the heavy wooden stock catching the first gunman squarely in the jaw. The man crumpled with a grunt. The second man raised his pistol, but Annelise lunged from the shadows, swinging the iron poker with all her strength. The heavy iron connected with his wrist, and he howled in pain, his gun clattering to the floor. The fight was suddenly a chaotic, close-quarters brawl. Corbin, enraged, drew a small, ornate derringer from his coat and aimed it at Silas. "I'll kill you myself, you farmer," he snarled. But Annelise was faster. She threw herself at Corbin, not with a weapon, but with the full force of her body, knocking his arm aside just as the gun went off. The shot went wild, burying itself in the ceiling. Silas seized the moment, closing the distance and landing a hard, solid punch to Corbin's jaw. The rich man from the east, who had likely never been in a real fight in his life, staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He tripped over his fallen man and crashed to the floor. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving, the rifle now aimed directly at Corbin's heart. The two gunmen were moaning, one unconscious, the other clutching his broken wrist. The fight was over. Corbin stared up at Silas, then at Annelise, who stood beside him, poker still in hand, her face fierce and defiant. The terror was gone. For the first time, Corbin looked at his wife and saw not a possession, but a stranger who truly hated him. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a heavy, breathing silence, punctuated by the groans of Corbin's men. Silas kept the rifle trained on Corbin, his face a grim mask. The violence was done, but the emotional storm was just beginning. He had stood and fought for her, not as the ghost of his wife, but as Annelise. The distinction was stark and painful. He had protected a stranger, and now that the threat was gone, he didn't know what was left between them. Annelise looked from Corbin's pathetic, snarling face on the floor to Silas's strong, quiet form. In the heat of the fight, they had moved as one, a team bound by a desperate need to protect. Now in the quiet, the chasm of their separate pasts reopened. "Tie them up," Silas said, his voice flat. His gaze flickered to Annelise. "Please." She nodded, her movements stiff. She found rope in a storage box and, with a surprising lack of hesitation, began to bind the hands of the conscious gunman, who offered no resistance. Silas kept his rifle on Corbin, who was now pushing himself into a sitting position, dabbing at a trickle of blood on his lip with a silk handkerchief. "You will pay for this," Corbin spat, his arrogance returning. "I'll have the law on you before the week is out. You'll hang for kidnapping my wife." "She's not your wife anymore," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "She made her choice." He looked at Annelise, and a question hung in the air, more powerful than any threat Corbin could make. What now? After the men were securely tied, Silas dragged them to the barn and locked them in an empty stall. When he returned to the cabin, the adrenaline had faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Annelise was standing by the hearth, her back to him, her shoulders shaking. She was holding the open locket. The lie of Sarah was gone. The delusion that had kept him sane for months was shattered. All that was left was the truth. He was a lonely widower, and she was a runaway wife with a dangerous past. He walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up the small carved bird. He held it in his palm, the wood smooth against his calloused skin. "I carved these for her," he said, his voice rough. "My Sarah. She loved the birds." Annelise turned, her face streaked with tears. "She was lucky," she whispered, "to be loved like that." "I'm sorry," Silas said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate, "for calling you by her name, for trying to make you someone you weren't. It was wrong. I was just so alone." "You saved me," Annelise said, her voice gaining strength. "You gave me a place to heal. You gave me a name when I had none, even if it wasn't mine. You stood for me. No one has ever done that before. She took a step closer to him, into the warm circle of firelight. My past is over. Corbin is finished, but I have no future. I have nowhere to go. Silas looked at her, truly saw her for the first time. Not as a ghost, not as a replacement, but as Annelise. A woman of incredible strength and resilience. A woman who had fought for her own life. Maybe, he said slowly, his heart daring to hope for something real, something earned. Maybe you could build one here. She looked around the small, battered cabin. It wasn't a cage. It was a sanctuary. She looked at him, at his kind, weary eyes. He was not a memory. He was solid and real. She reached out a tentative hand and placed it on his arm. His muscles tensed at her touch, but he didn't pull away. I think, she said, a small, true smile touching her lips for the first time. I would like that very much, Silas. 1 year later, the cabin was no longer a place of ghosts, but a home teeming with life. The splintered door had been replaced with a new one, sturdy and strong, made from oak. Silas had felled himself. Annelise had planted a garden, and rows of green shoots now pushed through the dark, rich earth, promising squash and beans and corn. The silence was gone, replaced by the easy rhythm of shared work and quiet conversation. They had taken Corbin and his men to the nearest town, where the story of his cruelty and Annelise's ordeal had caused a scandal that followed him all the way back east, his reputation in tatters. The law had seen the truth in their eyes and left them in peace. The name Sarah was spoken now not with pain, but with a gentle reverence, a memory honoured, but no longer a shadow to live in. Annelise and Silas had built something new on the foundations of truth and mutual respect. They were married by the travelling circuit judge in the fall, a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin with the peddler, Jeb, as their only witness. It wasn't a marriage of desperate convenience, but one of slow-growing, deeply rooted love, a love that had been tested by fire and found to be true. One bright spring afternoon, Silas was mending a fence line while Annelise sat on the porch steps, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. A new, small cradle, carved by Silas from the same pale wood as the birds, sat just inside the doorway. Annelise was with child, their own innocent, a symbol not of a past to be replaced, but of a future to be built together. She hummed a real tune now, a simple folk melody she had somehow remembered, her voice clear and sweet on the afternoon air. Silas stopped his work and leaned against the fence post, watching her. He saw the way the sun caught in her dark hair, the peaceful, contented expression on her face, the hollow ache in his chest. The one that had been his constant companion for so long was gone. It had been filled, not by a ghost, but by a real, breathing, laughing woman who had chosen him and a life with him. He walked back to the cabin, wiping the sweat from his brow. He sat down on the steps beside her and took a handful of peas from the bowl, popping one in his mouth. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the gentle snap of the pea pods and the song of a meadowlark in the distance. I saw a hawk today, he said finally, circling the valley. Annelise smiled. You always did love the birds, she teased gently. He looked at her, his heart full. No, he said, his voice soft but sure. I love you, Annelise. And in the quiet warmth of the afternoon sun, that was the only truth that mattered. What happens when we are given a second chance, not to reclaim what was lost, but to build something new from the ruins? Annelise and Silas found that the deepest love isn't about replacing the past, but about having the courage to create a future together. Their story reminds us that home isn't always a place you are from, but a place you find, and family isn't always the one you are born into, but the one you build. What do you think is the strongest foundation for love? Let us know in the comments below. And if their story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales of hope and redemption. We'll see you in the next story.